The most difficult concept in JavaScript is promises, so it's completely normal if you're confused by them. If you watch this video all the way to the end, you'll walk away with much more clarity. We can create promises and we can consume promises. The vast majority of the time as a developer, you only have to consume promises. But let's start by looking at how to create a promise. So I will say const p, this will be a new promise. Right, so this is the syntax for creating a new promise. And this already looks a little bit strange. What is this new? Why is this a capital case? Well, it's not really important that you understand how this works, but promise is basically a blueprint for how a promise should be, right? So then with new promise, we are creating an actual promise, an instance, and we can create as many as we want, right? So I could say P2, new promise, another one, right? And this would give me another promise. I could say P3, another promise. But if we do this, all the promises will be the same. So we can customize each one by passing an input here, right? So we can pass an argument here to customize this particular promise that we're creating. And usually when you give an input to a function, it's a string, right? With some text or maybe a number. But here we're actually going to use a function, right? So we can pass functions as arguments in JavaScript. And I'm going to use the modern arrow function syntax, which looks like this. And a function can also have parameters, right? So this is the function, and a function can have parameters. So the typical ones here are resolve and reject, right? So then in here, we need to decide when we consider this promise that we're creating here to be resolved, or also called fulfilled. That's the successful case. And when we consider it to have failed, and so therefore should be rejected, right? So I'm just gonna create a quick example here. So we'll use a new variable. I'm going to call this number of customers. Let's say we have 10 customers. And if the number of customers is more than 5, we consider it to be a success, right? So in this case, we have the successful case basically, and we should use resolve, right? And else, well, we have failed. This is failure. So here we should reject. Right, so a promise always ends in either being resolved or fulfilled or rejected, right? So when you create a promise, you need to specify when it's resolved or fulfilled or rejected. Now, when a promise is resolved or fulfilled, it also gives a value, and that's what we pass here. So here with resolve, in the successful case, we will simply pass success, right? So I will say fulfilled with value. And if it's rejected, we should pass a reason for the rejection, right? So I will just say not enough promotion, right? So failure with reason. Okay, so this is an example of how to create a promise. Now let's talk about how we can consume a promise. So we have to deal with those two possibilities. Promise can be fulfilled or rejected. So we have our promise here. We've stored that in a variable called p. And what you can do with the promise is you can tag on .then to deal with the successful case, right? So then in here, we get the value from what we passed here, right? So we can call that value. And let's just log it to see if that works. But before we do that, let's also deal with the rejection, right? So if it's rejected, how do we deal with that here? Well, we can tag on .catch. And here we get the reason for the rejection, right? That's what we pass here. So we say reason. And let's also log that. Okay, so I'm gonna open this in the browser. Okay, so I have opened our project in the browser here, and I have live reload enabled, so it immediately updates the page whenever I make a change, and it has logged success, right? So if I refresh here and load the page again, it will still log success. Why is that? Well, the promise here, if we look at the creation, the number of customers is 10. 10 is more than 5, right? So the promise is gonna be resolved, right? And the value with that fulfillment is success. So then here when we consume that promise, the promise is fulfilled. So here in .then we deal with that. right? We log the value that we get, and we don't go in .catch here because it's not rejected. Let's say we only get one customer, right? So now I'm going to change the number here, and now the number of customers is 1. So now the promise should be rejected. And indeed, when I saved here, you can already see in the console, now we're logging not enough promotion, right? So here where we consumed the promise was rejected. And so we dealt with that in the catch block. Okay, so this is a simple example of how to consume a promise with .then and .catch. Now we also have modern improved syntax to consume a promise. And this is with async await. So let me make this full screen again. Now it's gonna do and work the exact same as with .then, but many people consider async await to be nicer syntax, right? Also called syntactical sugar, right? So we have our promise P, right? We still have a promise, and we can tack on .then on a promise. But now with the modern syntax, we can also write await in front of the promise. Right, so we're not replacing promises with async await. This is a common mistake that I see, thinking that we're replacing promises. And that's not the case, right? It's just, we're still working with a promise here, but it's a different syntax for consuming it basically, right? We were using .then before, and now we're using await. Now remember, a promise can be fulfilled or rejected. When it's fulfilled, it will give us a value, and that is still the same. And we can store that value in a new variable that we could call, well, simply value, right? Just like before. And also, just like before, we can log that value, right? So let's just do the same. Now this will not work. We have to put this in a function. So I'm gonna create a function here. I'm just gonna call it check results. The name here is not really important. Right, so if you use await, you have to do that in a so-called async function. So basically just write async here. Now these days we can also use await outside an async function, and this is called top level await, but there are certain conditions for this, and most often you actually do use it in a function, right? So if the promise that we have here is fulfilled, we get a value and we store that here and then we log it. Now what if this promise is rejected? Previously we had .catch, and here we can use the try catch statement in JavaScript. This is a standalone statement, but it's often used in conjunction with async await. And here we also have a catch block, right? So here we will still catch the reason basically, and we can do the same as before. Just log it for now. And that's basically the equivalence in async await. And it looks a little bit complicated, but this is preferred by many people because the code will look much cleaner when you work with multiple promises. Now we've just created a function and we can immediately call the function here. Otherwise we won't see anything in the console. And I'm gonna comment out the previous option. Okay, so let's quickly check this out in the browser. So now if I load the page here, we see not enough promotion. So let's see if that is correct. So the number of customers is 1. So indeed it should be rejected, right? If I make this 100, it should be fulfilled. And indeed, the promise here is fulfilled, right? So we get success here as a value, and then we log that here, right? So it's still working. It's just a different syntax. It does the exact same as here. All right, so that's async await. I'm gonna comment all of this out. Okay, so then let's talk about why and where we use promises in web development. So I have some notes here, which I'm just going to paste here. So the vast majority of your code is synchronous, right? So here, for example, here on the first line, we're creating a new variable called a, and we're assigning the number 1 to that variable. And while it's doing that, the program is frozen, so we cannot do anything else while that's happening. And only when that has been completed, we go to the next line, right? And here we're creating another variable called b. We're assigning 2 to that. And only when that is completed do we go to the next line, right? So that is synchronous, line by line. We cannot do something else until this one has been completed. And that's not a problem here because these operations are very fast. So they only freeze our program for a very short amount of time. However, some operations may take a long time and we want to use asynchronous code for them so they don't freeze our program for so long. And asynchronous code was commonly implemented with callback functions, but these days increasingly with promises. So the most common examples of using promises in web development are the following. So on the front end, by far the most common is making network requests, right? commonly done with the fetch API or with a library like Axios. And that's because a network request can take quite some time. On the front end, for example, if we need to get data from a remote server, right, we're gonna make a network request. So it's gonna go on the internet, it has to find the server, and then we need to wait for the response from the server, right? That may take like 10 seconds, let's say. So during those 10 seconds, we don't want to freeze our program, right? Imagine if a user clicks on a button during those 10 seconds. We still want to be able to deal with that click, right? And if this was synchronous, we had to wait until this is complete before we could deal with the click. Now, luckily, the fetch API, for example, we'll look at that example next, is asynchronous. If it takes 10 seconds in total, if during that time the user clicks on a button, we can still deal with that in our JavaScript, right? It will still react immediately. And on the back end in Node.js, for example, a common asynchronous task is to interact with the file system. For example, you need to read the contents of a file. Okay, now let's look at the most common example that you will be working with promises as a web developer, and that is with the fetch API, right? So if you need to make a network request on the front end, right? So let's say we want to get some data from a remote server, we can use fetch. And the only thing I have to specify here is the address, right? So that's going to be HTTPS. And I'm going to use a service here, which will give us some fake data. It's called regress.in. And then usually with external APIs, there's the word API in the URL. And then after that, it's the name of the resource that you're interested in. So in this example, let's say that we're interested in users, right? So we want to get some users. Let's actually see what we get here from fetch. So I can log whatever is returned from that. And I'm gonna open this in the browser again, right? So if I save here, let's see what we get. And what we get is actually a promise, right? So the browser has created a promise and we only have to consume the promise here, right? So fetch here returns a promise, right? So it's the same as what we had before, right? So you can just imagine P. And to consume the promise, we can pick between two options. We can say .then, right? Or we can put await in front of it, right? So here with this example, I will use the traditional syntax. Fetch returns a promise, so we can tack on .then. And usually this is formatted like this. It looks a little bit better. And in here, we will deal with the fulfillment case, right? The successful case, right? So the browser, when it creates the promise here, has decided that the promise from fetch here will fulfill with an object representing the response that we get from the server, right? So then here we get access to that, right? We can call that response or just res. And let's actually see what we get. Okay, so now we get a response object here. Let's see what's in there. So we don't have to understand everything here, but we do see the HTTP status code, which is 200. Anything in the 200 range is good. And if the status code is in the 200 range, this OK property will be true. Otherwise it will be false. And then we see body, and this will actually be the data that we're interested in. And it's something with stream. And this is because we could have a lot of data, right? So we don't get all of the data initially here with the first response. We have to wait some additional time before all the data has been streamed in, right? So initially we just get some headers and some meta information basically, but the actual body data takes some additional time. And during the waiting, we don't want to freeze our program, right? So what we're going to do here is we're going to use res.json. So JSON, because the data that we get back will be in JSON format. And we can't work with JSON in our program the way we want to. So we need to convert the data from JSON to normal JavaScript. And that's what we can do with this .json method. Now, like I said, it may take some time before we have all the data, right? And we don't want to freeze our program while that's happening. So with this method as well, we get a promise, right? So this will give us a promise, right? So just like before P. What we could do here is we could say .then, but then we start nesting these .thens, so it gets very messy. We can also say await, right? But then we start mixing it with then. That's also not ideal. So what we can also do is simply return the promise, right? So this will give us a promise and we are returning that. Okay, and if you return the promise here, when that promise resolves or fulfills, we can deal with that in another .then block. Right, so we can chain these .thens, right? So then in here, we get the value from this promise when it's fulfilled, right? And the value will be the actual complete data in normal JavaScript format, right? Because it's already been parsed for us here. Now, by the way, since this is an arrow function, this is also commonly written like this, on one line. And in an arrow function, if you run it on one line like this, there is an implicit return. So we can even remove the return keyword, right? But the promise that we get here is still returned. When it's fulfilled, we still get the value here in the next dot then, right? So let's see what we get. Okay, so then in here, we get the actual complete data that we want. Usually when you get data back, you're not interested in everything, right? So I'm not interested in support or total here. I'm interested in the actual, well, they also call it data, right? So then in here, we have the actual users, right? So we can try outputting one of them, right? So I have to drill down a little bit here. So it's another dot data, and then let's pick user at index 2 and just see what the email is, right? So we have the email. Right, so we can do whatever we want with the data in here. Okay, so now we're dealing with the successful case, right? So if the successful case from this promise, right, that's the value of that is what we get here. And then the successful case of this promise, the value of that is what we get here. Now, what happens if, for example, the promise that we get here gets rejected? Well, we can simply tack on .catch. And the browser, when it rejects this promise, when a promise is rejected, usually it comes with a reason, and that will usually be an error object. So we can call that error. I'm actually just gonna log it. I can write it on one line. Right, in the real world, you would maybe show an error component or message on the page, right? But if this promise that we get here is rejected, we go in the catch block. Now, when is this promise rejected? Well, this actually doesn't happen very often. It only happens when there is a network issue. So, for example, your internet falls out. Therefore, the request response cycle cannot be completed, and so this first promise here will be rejected. Right? That's how the browser has configured this promise. Now, this other promise that we get from rest.json, this is commonly rejected if the server sends back something that is not a JSON format, right? Because we're trying to parse the data as JSON here. Once we have it all streamed in, we're trying to parse it as JSON, but sometimes the server sends back something that may not be JSON. In that case, the promise it will reject. We also go in the same catch block here, right? So we only need one catch for all the promises in that chain. Now, on a side note, something else can go wrong with our request. For example, we could be making a request for a resource that does not exist. In that case, the server should send back a response with a 404 status code, indicating that, well, the resource does not exist. But in that case, the request response cycle is still completed, right? So this promise will not reject, right? Because we still get a response, right? And it's just the server telling us, hey, this resource does not exist, right? So people typically deal with that in a different way. Let me expand this again. So here we can check for the OK property. Remember that one? So if the OK property is not true, right? So if the OK property is not in the 200 range, for example, it is 404 or sometimes also 500, right? Like a generic server error. Then we go in here, and for now we'll just keep it simple. I will just log problem, and then we want to return here. We do not want to continue down here, right? Because there's been a problem. We need to deal with that first here, right? We're just logging here, but we would have to deal with that here, right? So here, if the OK property is not in the 200 range, we go in here and we return out of the function, right? So we're in the function here, right? This is a function, and a function stops when it encounters the return keyword, right? So we don't go down here, right? If we go in here. Now, if the OK property is in the 200 range, we don't go in here and we simply get all the way here, right? So the fetch API works like this. One way to make this a little bit more sophisticated is to also try to reject a promise here, because then we will also go in the catch block here, and then we have one place to deal with all the issues, right? So we get a promise here. If this rejects, we go in catch. We also get a promise here. If this one rejects, we go in catch, right? And then also here, where we have an issue, if we reject a promise here, we can also go in catch. And then in catch, we can deal with all the issues, right? Nice one place centralized where we can deal with everything, right? So what we want to do here is we want to get some promise that we can simply reject, right? Out of convenience. And we can actually very easily do this, right? So remember new promise. right? I called this the blueprint for a promise. Well, there's also something called static methods. So we have this blueprint basically. Other people will call this a class or a constructor function. It has certain methods that we can use. So one of them is promise.reject. And this will give us, right, this will give us a promise that is, well, immediately rejected, right? And we want to give a reason, right? When a promise rejects, we want to give a reason. So we could say, you know, something in the 400 or 500 status code issue, right? So here we get a promise that is rejected, and we do have to return that promise, right? So now I have to move the return keyword one line upwards. So when I save here, we won't see it because the status code is in the 200 range here, but I can move it out of here to see what we get if this is the first thing that we do here. And now indeed, when we return a promise that is rejected, we go in catch here, and error here will be the string that we pass here, right? And that's what we log here, right? So this is already a little bit more sophisticated. Now we can make this even more sophisticated with async await. And I have a video on that where we convert a fetch call from .then to the modern async await with try catch. Right, that's a popular syntax, so I recommend that you watch that after this one. All right, now we're almost finished here. Last point I have to make is when, well, sometimes we have to work with multiple promises and we need to coordinate between them. For example, let's say I have a social media application, and let's say a user wants to see a photo, right, in this app. But let's say I only want to show the photo with the comments. So I have to fetch the photo, right? We could use a fetch call to get the photo. And then I also have to fetch the comments, right? So then I would have to make another fetch call for the comments. These are going to be two different fetch calls. And we want to wait until both of them are complete, right? Both of them have been fulfilled. And then we want to show the photo with the comments to the user, right? So in that case, I would have to make two fetch calls, right? And remember, fetch returns a promise. I could store that, by the way, in a variable, right? Fetch promise, right? So then the promise would be stored in here, right? Or I could wrap it in a function. That's not really important here, the exact syntax. The point here being is I can use Promise.all and it expects an array here, and I could have two promises, right? So in this example, I'm gonna fetch the photo. That's gonna be, I'm gonna get a promise from that. And I'm gonna fetch the comments, and I'm gonna get a promise from that. And only when both of them have been fulfilled do I want to do something. So with Promise.all, it takes in an array of promises and it returns one promise, right? So just like before, we can say .then on that, right? So I can say .then, and here I will get the values from the promises that have been fulfilled, right? And I can do something with that. Right, render post, right? And if one of them rejects, the entire promise here will also reject, right? So this is something that you're going to see sometimes. Something else that you're going to see sometimes is Promise.any. Let me also quickly show you that. So here we were interested in both of them, right? We needed both of them, but sometimes you have, let's say, two, but you only need one of them. So for example, let's say I need to fetch a photo, and this photo can be on multiple servers. So I'm gonna try to fetch the photo from one particular server and then also from another server. And I'm not interested in both of them. I'm only interested in the one that returns the photo first, right? So I could say fetch photo from server 1. Can get a promise from that. And then also I can try fetching the photo from another server and I can get a promise from that. I just want to get the quickest one. Right, so I can deal with that in here and I get the value here that will be the photo and I can do something. Right, so if this promise fulfills earlier than this one, we will go in .then as soon as this one is fulfilled, right? So as soon as one of them is fulfilled, we go in .then here and we can already do something. Right, and we can use .catch to deal with rejections. All right, that covers most of it. Make sure to check out my JavaScript course in which we will build two beautiful real-world projects from scratch, and you will learn about all the other concepts in modern JavaScript that you need to know. So thanks for watching, and I hope to see you soon. Bye.